It is my extraordinary pleasure to have Rafeef with us. And I'm incredibly pleased and feel a little bit guilty to having forced her to do this because she is super, super, super busy right now. Rafeef is beyond everything else an extraordinary human being, a really great poet, a really incredible writer, and wonderful intellectual, and a major activist. She is a brilliant voice for many of the causes that matter to all of us on questions of anti-racism, support for migrants, and of course, perhaps most importantly, for the Palestinian liberation. And for that reason, she has been super busy, which is why I feel a little bit guilty about forcing her to write an abstract and come and do this with us. But on the other hand, Rafeef also does amazing research on questions of logistics and the Gulf, and has intimate knowledge about the subject in ways that I think are just absolutely brilliant and original and innovative. So on that note of extraordinary praise, I'm going to hand it to Rafeef with one quick proviso. What we do here is in this seminar is to ask our wonderful presenters to speak a little bit about how they came to this subject, something about their sort of the intimate background. So that is going to be how she's going to begin for those who haven't been to these seminars. Now I will hand it to you, Rafeef, please.
Thank you so much, Lale, for that very, very kind introduction. I really appreciate it. And please don't feel guilty. I was very happy to be forced to stop and reflect on some of the writing that I had been neglecting as this genocide is ongoing. I was also very thankful for the prompt to think about how I came into writing and researching about logistics in the Arabian Peninsula in particular. And it's very hard when you are a refugee and an exiled person to trace the lines of how you got to the research that you do. But I think that's where I would start. I would start with the sea. My family are refugees to Lebanon. They were very literally thrown into the sea on small boats. So I have always been interested in the sea. It was also the only place that I lived around my entire life as we kept having to move from one place to another. My entire history was around the Mediterranean Sea. So I am very interested in the sea, in movement, in who gets to move, how they get to move, and also this distinction that has really played the most major role in my life between those that are allowed to move freely and what is allowed to move freely, goods, commodities versus human beings. So before coming to this work, I was very interested in migration and the role of the sea, specifically racialized migration regimes and their impacts on women, particularly women coming from Syria, from Palestine. When I lived in Canada, I worked for quite some time with migrants and refugees coming from what people call the MENA region. And in that context, I became interested in tracing our collective stories of movement. How do people move across seas, airports? Where do people hide away? Where can people get passports to be able to move? And all those stories of migration. Another sector that brought me to this work was my activism as a trade union activist, but also in the Canadian context as a supporter of Indigenous activism, where the role of disruption was very important in blockading train lines and in thinking of the blockade as a very useful, interesting activist tool that can actually force the state to negotiate with Indigenous communities. I hadn't seen it actually play out in the way that it did in that context. And it was very interesting for me to be on those picket lines, to be on those blockades, helping, supporting, but also learning what it means to effectively disrupt supply chains that have become so central and so important to the way global capitalism functions today. And last but not least, right before starting to speak and write about logistics specifically, I was working at a small NGO called War on Want. I was what they called the militarism researcher. And in that capacity, I was looking at private military and security companies. This industry had exploded during the war on Iraq. And we were tracing this explosion, but also how it became embedded, normalized, and the whole concept of the privatization of war. In that context, I was going to many private military and security company conferences. Quite often, I'd be the only woman in attendance. And very quickly, you started to see in that industry that there was a split. The British industry considered the American companies the cowboys of the industry, but they were the legitimate, well-trained, respectful side of the industry. And this was very interesting to watch. The other conversation they were having is, how will this industry now move into the sea? How will it work on securitizing the sea? And from that, I really became interested in this intersection between militarism and logistics. How does war and commercial logistics work together? How do they intersect? How are these lines overlapping? And that is really where a lot of my work around the so-called logistics revolution in the Gulf Cooperation Council has led me, to look at these commercial entities, to look at all this explosion of port building, but also what underlies it in terms of militarism, changes to the region, the changing dynamics and growing new powers in the region, and how they're using logistics for military ends. And I won't say this now, I'll segue to it during my talk, but also how that links to humanitarianism as well. So we see a clear intersection between commercial logistics, military logistics, and humanitarian logistics, and how they all intersect and actually prop up each other. That would be, in a nutshell, how I came to this project. I should also say that this wouldn't have happened and I wouldn't have moved in this direction if Lale didn't have that amazing project at SOAS, and I was the postdoc on that project. And it really opened an entire new terrain to think of infrastructures as well. So my work on the sea, labor, migration, war, and militarism all came together with this interest in infrastructures through this project.
Wonderful, thank you. Please feel free to go on with your presentation, and I've made you co-host, so if you need to, you can put on a PowerPoint. Thank you very much. So excited to have you here.
Let me just sort my PowerPoint out. 1 second. All right, is that working? Can you see it okay? Okay. So what I want to do today is speak about Gulf logistics in the context of all these diversification strategies they are having. I'm going to first try to establish what this logistics revolution is generally, but then speak a little bit about how it has landed within the Gulf Cooperation Council context and what this means. So I'll start very broad. We all come from very different disciplines, so I wasn't sure how much people know about the technicalities of the logistics revolution. So I'm going to start quite broad and then try to narrow it down. I'm also starting to move in a different direction in terms of thinking about this. So I would really love any ideas you have, readings you have, suggestions you have for the kind of work I'd like to start doing next. So let me start with this quote from Deborah Cowan: the entire network of infrastructures, technologies, workers, and violence that makes the circulation of stuff possible remains tucked out of sight for those who engage with logistics only as consumers. So most of us, when we interact with the world of commodities, we're not really thinking of the infrastructures and the technologies, and especially the labor that got those commodities to us. part of what I would like to do is think about this chain of logistics as it applies within the Gulf Cooperation Council. Bruce Robbins insists that infrastructures needs to be made visible, of course, in order to see how present landscapes are a product of past projects, past struggles, past corruption, but we also need to make infrastructure visible as a guide to the struggles of the present. And this is a really key question of contestation that we see keep coming up and again in the context of the Middle East, this constant contestation around infrastructures. David Harvey brought this down all the way to the context of grapes that sit upon the supermarket shelves that are mute. We cannot see the fingerprints of exploitation upon them or tell immediately what part of the world they are from. So partly what I'm interested in is this question of infrastructures and contestation, because we don't often see infrastructures. Most of the time when I tell people I study infrastructures or ports, they just look at me dumbfounded as to why I am doing this, because we generally only think of infrastructures once they stop working. But if we look at recent struggles within the MENA region in particular, most of them have actually been around infrastructures or infrastructural failure, whether it's garbage collection in Lebanon, access to clean drinking water in Iraq, access to electricity again in Lebanon and other parts of the region. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic made visible how supply chains, protective equipment, vaccine production and distribution were all questions of circulation. So if we take a look at the world map of circulation, that we would see something that looks like this. So these types of interconnections on oceans globally. Now, most of us studying in the social sciences tend to be very ground-centric in politics, or what they call political science. At least we tend to stay within the confines of a nation state. Thinking of circulation and logistics really pushes us out into the oceans, into the seas, and this world of circulation. For us who are interested in the Gulf Cooperation Council region in particular, this is a map of circulation of oil. And you see very clearly the transition here in terms of production of oil, how the majority is today going towards East Asia, but also the choke points that are still critical within the region that really still define so much of the importance of this trade route and why there's so much contestation over it. Now, trade and logistics have been a serious preoccupation full of neoliberal rationalities. The prominence of export-led development models expanded the centrality of integrated supply chains and logistics. As a matter of fact, I would say logistics itself became a goal of development, logistics as development. Ideas of comparative advantage, trade liberalization underlie the overall preoccupation with transport infrastructures and logistics as a basis for integration into global trade networks. So we see in 2007, the World Bank produces a logistics index for every state to benchmark tools for measuring things like quality of transport infrastructures, timeliness, tracking and tracing, customs, and logistics services. In 2004, UNCTAD develops the Liner Shipping Connectivity Index to determine countries' positions within global lining shipping networks. So here we see all these international organizations starting to make logistics itself and logistical infrastructures themselves the basis for development. And here, many authors have written about the so-called logistics revolution that happens earlier in the 60s. Analysis of the logistics revolution is typically framed by changes in late 20th century capitalism and the essential role of intermodal mega transport infrastructures, connected logistics corridors in shaping the speciality of global commodity circulation. In short, what we have is an integrated system of movement of commodities across supply chains that circulate the globe over. Scholars pointed specifically to the set of techno-scientific innovations, such as the container and computerized modeling, which really helped to standardize and reduce circulation time, integrating regions differentially into what Singh has termed supply chain capitalism. We really see this as the speeding up of the supply chain, the integration of different regions, but also within each state, we see that countries begin to privatize transport infrastructures and ensure that they are connected to others as a measure of development. So we're seeing integrated corridors, almost an alternate set of trade routes that are sitting on top of what already exists to speed up circulation. Within this, of course, maritime transport continues to be the primary mode of trade in the global economy. Around 80% of global trade by volume and 70% of global trade by value are carried by sea and are handled by ports worldwide. Ports thus form a very critical node in a global political economy based on internationalized production and ever more complex supply chains. Containerization. From the 1980s to 2015, we see that seaborne container trade actually increased by 1,500%. This is really remarkable. When people speak about globalization and trade, essentially they are speaking about these containers moving around the world at speed, but also the volume of these containers increasing. Containerization increased the automation of ports as a result of mechanized handling of standard size boxes. We don't often think about this, but just the idea that there's a standard box that can move in itself changed very much the way transportation works, because you had this idea of intermodality, that this container can move from one form of transport to the next because it's standardized. This, in turn, has also had significant impact on ship size and port design. Container ship size has increased drastically, so we see the emergence of mega ports to accommodate this change. So the bigger containers, there are also the bigger ships, which necessitate these mega ports for this kind of circulation. This is just for those of you who are unfamiliar with the world of maritime trade. These are the kinds of ships you will see on the oceans: reefers, tankers, bulk carriers, container vessels. Roll on and roll off are usually for cars or tankers, etc., and gas carriers. So anytime you would look into the oceans, this is the kind of ships that you will see moving about. So 3 words really that kind of summarize this moment are containerization, standardization, and intermodality. We had the containers coming forward. This standardized the way shipping happens, and you get intermodality of transport. Something can be moved from a ship to a train to an airport. And this really tells us so much around the Gulf Cooperation Council and how it has tried to build infrastructures that really support this form of intermodality. This is the ship size for those of you interested. By 2018, this was the shift in ship size and how much they were growing. This is particularly important because it says something about the size of the ports that get to be built. In order to handle a ship at 22 TEUs, this is really important because you need the kind of mega shipping ports that can actually handle that. And this is very much what's being constructed across Gulf Cooperation Council states. So we have terminal operators, of course, and one of the things we see, some of the work that I've done, is try to trace this industry and what has happened in it. And what we have seen is a shift eastwards of the terminal operators in particular, where we now have these as the 5 leading companies. These firms, among them, control a staggering 50% of container trade of port operations globally. Interestingly, for our case, of course, is the Dubai Ports World is actually one of those companies. So people often neglect the Gulf Cooperation Council in terms of their place in the global political economy. I think this really pushes us to think about the place of the United Arab Emirates and Dubai in particular, and its corporations in the global political economy. And of course, as I was saying earlier, one of the things that authors of this logistics revolution have really stressed is this intersection between war and logistics. Logistics has not only been a techno-scientific shift, it has very much been at the heart of a global capitalist system that draws on this intersection of war and logistics. Authors have noted that actually the roots of business logistics lie in war making. The military art of moving soldiers and supplies to the front has become a business science that animates all aspects of war making, writes Cowan. Although it was forged in earlier military contexts, the Vietnam War, a, a lot of writing about the container will actually say how this was an innovation of the Vietnam War in order to get supplies to the military. One of the things we see really change is with the US-led war on terror, the increasing centrality of privatized logistics to modern warfare. This is private logistics companies becoming part and parcel of the war machine. So when we think of the privatization of war, many of the aspects that were actually privatized were the logistical aspects of modern warfare. That's why we see a major intersection between the war-making supply chains and the commercial supply chains overlapping. Logistics corporations in particular developed into significant components of military missions, often contracted to move supplies or take on feeding troops, for example, or housing troops. So many of the logistics companies that you see in the Middle East today, for example, have their history servicing the US military in the region. And this is an important feature of how the logistics industry actually develops on a regional scale. So why does this matter? How is this logistics revolution actually landing in the Arabian Peninsula? What we have seen is a frenzy of port construction across the Gulf Cooperation Council. Ports typically are anchored within free trade zones that link to road and air infrastructure and also provide warehousing, commercial, and office facilities. These zones are governed through highly liberal trade and investment regulations designed to attract foreign and local corporations, including investments such as 100% foreign ownership, zero corporate tax for 50 years, a concession that is renewable, when you are invested in these industrial zones that are related to the ports. Now, the corporate press is rife with information and opportunities about the Gulf Cooperation Council logistics market. But scholarly work analyzing this development has really lagged behind. Most work on maritime infrastructure in the Gulf tends to focus on the Emirate of Dubai as the location of the Gulf's largest port and the Gulf city that is most integrated into global trade networks. So, of course, today I will speak about Dubai's Jebel Ali port. It will feature in the analysis, but really what I want to get at is that this is happening across the region. A lot of these development vision documents that we see are very much about the development of ports, of these logistics cities, and of these free trade zones. So there is really a need for those of us who are studying the Gulf Cooperation Council to move away from the Dubai-centric character of much of the logistics literature to really understand the wider dynamics of the GCC as a whole and to take account of the rapid changes that are happening. The logistics literature has largely focused on the major logistics nodes in the global north. We really need to start to think of how do we bring this literature into the region, but also to think about why is logistics moving to areas like the Arabian Peninsula? In the case of the Gulf Cooperation Council, what we are seeing is a very contradictory process of infrastructural duplication and an increasing competition among both states and port operators to dominate this important trade route. So what I argue after looking at these ports following these infrastructures is that we really need a critical theorization of unevenness in the development of logistics across spaces. In other words, an understanding the logistics revolution remains an unfinished and contested process, with particular instances may accentuate regional hierarchies. And this is really what we're seeing in the GCC. The GCC has become a central node in worldwide circulation of commodities. The reasons for the growth of the Gulf's logistics infrastructure relates to its strategic geographic location along the Asia-Europe trade route, which has propelled massive levels of expenses on mega transport infrastructures, including ports, airports, trains, and roads. More than 60% of the total expenses on ports in the Middle East is located in the Gulf Cooperation Council. Both new megaport construction and expansion of existing ports are taking place, with new highly automated ports designed to accommodate the largest container ships in the world. This is particularly important because it comes with acquisition of land, but it also comes with environmental changes to the oceans themselves. For the building of such megaports, essentially what is happening is a constant process of dredging and blowing up the ocean. So for a country like Qatar, for example, to actually construct a harbor at that scale, we are literally seeing the oceans being blown up, massive acts of dredging in order to build these types of infrastructures and ports. These port projects are integrally linked to the development of wider logistics networks, including passenger, freight railway schemes, airports, special economic zones, and all of the words that we see littered in these vision documents. Although there has been trade ties between the GCC, South Korea, and Japan previously, China's insertion into the global economy, in particular, prompted a substantial increase in the export of oil, gas, and petrochemical materials from the GCC eastwards, and very significantly in reverse, the import of a vast array of commodities from East Asia for internal GCC consumption and re-export to Europe and other areas. So often when we think of the GCC, there is a focus, and I would say an over-focus simply on oil and the export of oil without actually thinking of this inverse process that has happened with the region becoming one of the main alleyways for the commodities coming from East Asia across to Europe. But also the region's ports act as feeder ports for African smaller ports as well. A key theme of economic policymaking in the GCC is, of course, the notion of diversification. So these port projects are often talked about in terms of diversification, an attempt to expand alternative industries beyond the hydrocarbons production. These diversification strategies have been elaborated through a series of vision documents that I'm sure many of you have heard about, which outline the prioritization and proposed investment in these sectors. These vision documents are written in elaborate corporate-style language. They are typically drafted by foreign consultancy firm advisors, and they form the centerpiece of economic planning in the GCC. Also, although there's a big debate about this diversification, whether it's real or not, one thing that we cannot take for granted is that this major construction of ports is happening. And it echoes the emphasis placed on trade infrastructure by international financial institutions. So if you look at the vision documents of each country, Kuwait's vision document, for example, for 2035 aims to develop Kuwait as a financial and commercial hub. As part of this, Kuwait's new Mubarak port is designed in order to do this. Bahrain similarly is trying to construct itself as a manufacturing and logistics hub. And if you look at the vision documents of most of these states, you will see this push in order to construct more logistics. So one of the things I've been tracing is all of this port construction. Underlying this is, of course, the idea that there is going to be growth and continuous growth in containerization and in containers coming into these areas. By all measures, whatever increase there is in container trade, the amount how big these ports are and what is being constructed, a lot of them will actually remain empty because global trade is not going to increase at that speed. But what you are seeing, and as you could see in this map, is a lot of ports actually being dotted right next to each other. This is mega ports being built right next to each other. This is why I was referring to duplication in these projects. A lot of them, we are still unsure if they will end up being white elephant projects, but we see massive duplication in this process. Because these vision documents look so identical to each other, there's hardly differentiation between them in terms of the development vision they are putting forward. What we are seeing is this massive duplication of the so-called Dubai model. But how all of this will sit next to each other, you can already see that it will be creating tensions or at least competition among the port operators who will operate within this zone. So far, I'm just speaking about this port construction happening internally within the Gulf Cooperation Council. This does not begin to speak to the internationalization of this logistics space of the Gulf. So GCC states have taken advantage of their insertion into global trade logistics networks, pre-existing infrastructures, loose regulations, and high flexibility of a racialized labor regime. This is essentially the attraction of these states and why the logistics industry can flourish under this kind of system. The degree to which such regional actors are able to market themselves as islands of stability and efficiency in otherwise chaotic neighborhoods, i.e., the Middle East region, serves to strengthen their value as logistics hubs. Now, this is a discursive framing, and the reason I have it in quotations is because when you look at the logistics materials, a lot of them will actually say our countries are islands of stability. This terminology is used. And this is a discursive framing that often codes for authoritarian stability and lack of labor rights. And of course, we see the emergence of a commercial military nexus. It's not coincidental that this is one of the most militarized trade routes internationally. It is critical to consider the overlap between commercial and military functions within these logistics spaces. The UAE, for example, is pivotal to the wider US-led regional order in the Gulf. And it has been in an alliance described by former commander of all US troops in the Middle East, Anthony Zinni, as the strongest relationship the United States has in the Arab world. The UAE-US Defense Cooperation Agreement gives the US military almost unfettered use of the UAE's logistical infrastructure, and American military personnel are frequently stationed at the ports of Fujairah, Jabal Ali, and other locations throughout the country. Now, this is important because Jabal Ali is really the model that those other states are trying to duplicate. Indeed, Jabal Ali is the US Navy's busiest overseas ports of call, with a deep water harbor able to accommodate larger US military vessels. This centrality of the UAE's networked logistics space to the projection of Western military power is closely entwined with the growth of this flourishing private logistics sector. Dubai in particular, its logistics sector grew largely because it was the logistics hub for the so-called war on terror. So the logistics companies, the reason these logistics companies rose in such rapid space was largely because of the war on terror. So you really cannot extract the UAE's position in logistics chains from the US military power in the region. And part of what I've been looking at is this intersection of war, trade, and aid. Because what we start to see is the growth of these ports, not just within the Gulf Cooperation Council, but we start to see it as a way of controlling the entirety of that trade route with investments in other ports. So DP World, for example, has investments in Somaliland, Eritrea. It used to be in Djibouti, but the port was nationalized, and now there's a Chinese company actually running the port. But what you really start to see is this trend towards ensuring that this entire trade route actually has commercial ports. When you look more closely at each investment, you see that it comes with also humanitarian aid and policing and the building of military bases. So one of the ways that the United Arab Emirates logistics space in particular has been growing is when those contracts are being set up, they're being set up to ensure that there is a port, but also that next to that port, there is a policing station and military equipment is being supplied. So this intersection of war, trade, and aid becomes particularly evident when you see the growth of this logistics space outside of the Gulf Cooperation Council itself. And we really saw this clearly with the war in Yemen. The United Arab Emirates, in particular, in that war, one of its strategic moves throughout the war was the control of Yemeni ports. And we have not seen this change with the new dynamics. There's now a lot of discussion of pullback out of Yemen, so on and so forth. But what we really see is actually the United Arab Emirates is really embedded in the future of Yemen and in the future of Yemeni ports, how they will be constructed, what new construction would look like into the future. This is something to really consider and think about when we're thinking about militarism, is that it's not simply about the war as it happens, but also what's following these wars with these reconstruction agendas, particularly around ports. As most of you would see today, the disruptions that are happening along this trade route are really shaking the global economy, but I'll turn to speak about that towards the end. What we see is also at the intersection, not of just militarism and war, but also what I call logistical humanitarianism. So this is rooted in business logistics, but humanitarian logistics elevates supply chain efficiency, return on donor investment, and privatization of service delivery as key drivers of humanitarian action. As I was doing my research going about the ports happily, I discovered Dubai Humanitarian City. Dubai Humanitarian City sits within the Jabal Ali complex in the zone, in the free trade zone. And it's actually responsible for so much of the aid that is circulated internationally. It is one of the key hubs of humanitarian aid. So here we see that these commercial logistics spaces also become ways for countries to market themselves as humanitarian hubs. But just as we see that there is duplication in port construction, there is also duplication in which Gulf Cooperation state is trying to portray itself as the most humanitarian. So now there are humanitarian cities that are being built around Oman, in Saudi Arabia, and there's a competition for each state to attract more United Nations NGOs, United Nations associations and organizations to become the aid hub for them. So this continuous process of working together, but also in competition, you see it with commercial infrastructures, you see it around war, and also you see it within this humanitarian logistics sector. I won't speak too much to this. I've written a paper about logistical humanitarianism that goes through what this means, this building of logistical spaces that are for humanitarianism. But I just wanted to end up after this broad picture of what has been constructed, what is being constructed, and how it fits with the war machine, to think about two considerations that have been really on my mind. One of them is the question of disruption. And the other one is this tracing of the expansion of the Gulf Cooperation Council logistics space internationally. So a lot of the literature on logistics really focuses on the structural power of labor within logistics chains. So an important thread in the critical literature stresses labor's ability and its unique structural position to disrupt supply chains and interrupt trade routes. So much of this research has been around some of the most unionized ports because dock workers have historically been highly unionized. They're highly effective if they want to shut down a port. But this hasn't really translated into winning demands within the labor sector. And industrial relations scholars continue to debate the importance of organizing on multiple scales with these international supply chains. Now, one of the reasons I had argued previously that the Gulf Cooperation Council was becoming a hub for international logistics is precisely the loose labor regulations, the fact that unionization is largely not allowed, which means there can be less disruption in these spaces. And I think that still stands. I think we cannot extract this move of the international logistics industry into the Gulf without thinking about the racialized labor regime, which Lale has written about in her books and News of War and Trade. But I do think what has happened lately across that trade route, with the disruptions that have taken shape, also shows how fragile that space is. It is not necessarily the space that we thought of just continuous, seamless trade as the industry likes to project. It is still a highly militarized, highly contested space that has impact across regions. We saw this with the Ever Given when it was stopped, but we also see it today with all the Houthi attacks on the ships that are moving in that trade route, of course, in solidarity with the people of Palestine. So we really need to rethink disruption on that trade route in new ways, within labor, but also without labor, and what that is looking like, how it might affect that trade route, and the rethinking of the security within that trade route. The other part around this that I'm interested in is there is a big move of Gulf Cooperation Council corporations into the African continent. So there's a tendency in the literature to always dismiss these states and think of them as just vassals of US power, rather than actually look at them and their own dynamics and what they are trying to do. Within the literature of infrastructure, there's a major focus on China and Chinese investments in upcoming port projects in the context of the BRI. But the UAE, for example, is also keenly invested in linking up to logistical networks in African markets by strategically building up DP World's portfolio of ports and gateways in African states. DP World does not have a shipping arm like its competitors, but it has tended to invest heavily in terminals, logistics, and free trade areas. The company has several projects across Africa with operations in Senegal, Mozambique, Egypt, Algeria, Rwanda, Congo, and Somaliland. A major focus of the UAE's activities in Africa is Senegal, where DP World has been operating since 2008. A concession agreement really tries to build up Senegal as a hub. Similarly, DP World has recently launched a new global e-commerce platform in Rwanda that is aptly named Dubai, as in D-U-B-U-Y, which I think is a very fitting name for what they're trying to do. So I think there is plenty of work to be done for scholars of the Gulf Cooperation Council to really take seriously the political economy of those states, but also their internationalization into these networks, into these hubs, and what they are really trying to do, particularly in terms of African states and what they are doing. And I just wanted to end with this quote by Walter Rodney on how Europe underdeveloped Africa, because it really has me thinking all the time around these infrastructures, where they are leading us, what they are about. And I think we need a lot more critical work that takes Gulf Cooperation Council states very seriously in their expansion into logistics spaces. I am wary of the fact that they are still studied with a heavy Orientalist lens, which really blinds us to their role in the global political economy, but also their expansion. And I'm very glad to see a lot of my friends around who are studying the Gulf in a different way. And I'm glad we are now forming a bit of a Gulf Cooperation Council studies sector that actually looks beyond the Orientalism through which these states have been studied, beyond the fetishization of oil, and looks at these other dynamics. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Rafeef. As always, the lucidity with which you speak is just and the depth, it's just astonishing. Well, I would start by, the first question, and then after you answer, I'll turn off the recording and others can jump in. Is the very thing that you ended on, which is on the question of Africa. Can you please explain why the new scramble for Africa has these, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries so deeply involved? What is the interest, and does this interest extend beyond the sort of the geographic sort of proximity of East Africa to further afield, say Central Africa or West Africa? And then while you're talking about that, since you've been doing a bit of research on this, to what extent do you think this also has to do with the way that there seems to be, particularly in the case of Abu Dhabi, they seem to be moving in on trying to also monopolize potential alternatives to fossil fuels, the supply chains for those. Can you speak a little bit to that, please?
Thank you. I think there's many different factors. Partly these companies, as large conglomerates and large corporations, are looking for profits. They are logistics companies, so they try to grab onto whichever zones they can in order to expand their port assets, because the more port assets you have internationally, the bigger your logistics network. So it's partly that very basic corporate competition among the largest port operators to gain as many new ports, as many new terminals as they can. And that competition is quite strong because they hold such a large percentage of this global trade. Any new ports they have actually give them quite a lot of access. I've written about this in another context. I think food is a really big question. The issue of food, and because of how low resources of food are in the region, partly what is happening is constructing logistics networks that can be next to areas where there's a lot of food, farms in Egypt, farms in Sudan. You will see lately the UAE, for example, had said they would invest 1 billion in infrastructures in Sudan, and most of it was port infrastructure. This also has to do with land and food. I think whenever we speak about the GCC, we need to keep this question of food really central to the thinking about logistics. But I also agree with you. I think the strategic vision right now of this diversification is to insert the Gulf's oil companies very centrally into new fossil fuels and into the new green transition. So funnily enough, a lot of the oil companies are saying we are going for this new transition. So partly it's trying to market these companies, their expansion, for control, not just of the hydrocarbons trade in terms of oil, but also trying to establish their role in the green transition, their growth in these sectors. And I think to a large extent, they are succeeding. If you consider that COP, the last one happened in the United Arab Emirates and was actually chaired by an oil company, that tells us a lot about the future thinking and future projections. And that's also why I think we need to take those states seriously. And unfortunately, I think a lot of work on the Gulf still doesn't take at least their corporate sector seriously. And we really need to contend with where they're placing themselves in the green transition, in new energies, and how they're thinking of expanding into new territories. My focus has been the African continent, but there is also a move eastwards as well, and we need to think about that too, like ports in Pakistan, for example.
That is so brilliant. Thank you so much for this. I'm going to now turn off the recording, and I invite everybody who would like to speak to or ask a question to jump in.